Yeah, thank you for joining us on this session um, on this fascinating book on an important topic. I'm thrilled and honored to be here with John Keay um, to discuss this book. John is the author of more than 20 books, and his most recent book, Himalaya: Exploring the Roof of the World, came out a few months ago. But his relationship with the Himalayas started from the 60s when he first came here as a foreign correspondent for The Economist. In the decade after, he wrote and presented more than 100 documentaries with the BBC. And so most of his works are have various topics, but they are focused on India and the greater Indian subcontinent. His books are known for their meticulous research, but also their engaging narrative style, which make it, even for a wider audience, apart from historians, it makes it an engaging read and almost essential reading on the topic. So maybe we'll start with a question that I have for John. So, John, I noticed when you're introduced by other speakers, it's as a renowned historian, but there's a reluctance from you to kind of refer to yourself as a historian. Could you? Firstly, is that true?
Yes. I'm not sure about historian. I don't mind being called the history writer, because that's what I do. I write history. But I don't teach history. I'm not a historian in that sense. And I don't really write for other historians. I write for a wider readership. And that's unusual amongst academic historians anyway. So I'm a bit uncomfortable with the term historian, but history writer is fine. I always think, all the greatest history writers, historians in the English language were people who weren't really historians in the terms that we understand today. People like Macaulay and Carlyle and all the other great 19th century historians were writers. They weren't historians. I don't think they ever spent much time in the archives or in work in study groups. And so I think there's still a place for writers as historians rather than just historians as historians.
Yeah, and it's wonderful for a reader because the style becomes very narrative. You use characters to tell the stories, which is wonderful.
Yeah. History is just a lot of biographies, really.
Yeah.
And that's sometimes how I tell it. Sometimes, not always.
Sounds good. So, when you your early fascination with the Himalayas, like I know you came here as a foreign correspondent. Was that the first time you visited the Himalayas, or did you come as?
Yes, I first came to India and to Himalaya in about 1965. I'd left university, I suppose, in '63, and I'd had a short stint in advertising and had given up on the advertising business. So I was a dropout, really. And I came to Kashmir to do some fishing in 1965 and spent a couple of weeks fishing, very good trout fishing. And I came back either the following year or the year after, I can't remember exactly, and I lived in Kashmir for about 6 months, and it was there that I really started writing, because I needed to earn some money to pay the rent on my, wasn't really a houseboat, it was a kind of dunga, a kind of what they call a cookboat in Kashmir. And that was when I first started writing, and also when, was of course bowled over by the paradise on earth that Kashmir was in those days, and perhaps will be again, and spent quite a bit of time up in the hills, and then subsequently did various long treks, like from Simla to Srinagar, and I used to take trekking parties up into Ladakh and so on. So I'd really fallen in love with the mountains from a very early time. But I was a kind of mountain person right from the start. For the last 50 years I've lived in the West Highlands of Scotland, and something about hills and peace of mind to go together, and I'm always happiest amongst the hills anyway.
Yeah, and just leading off that, like Himalayas has kind of had its lure for, for tourists, but also for mountaineers over the years. Were you also were you interested?
No, I've never climbed a mountain in my life. I try and avoid climbing. I've occasionally had to cut steps with an ice axe where it was a bit vertical, and but I'm certainly not a climber, and I have no great wish actually to stand on top of the mountains. I like to be amongst the mountains. I like to have a skyline of mountains, but I have no great urge to conquer them. And I really, sometimes I feel a bit of a fraud when it comes to talking about Himalaya, because there are obviously so many people who really love the mountains as an arena for sport, either for skiing or climbing and so on. I'm afraid I don't come in that category.
And like a lot has been written. You've written a couple of books on the Himalayas as well. Like, what prompted you to write this book, and also the timing of it?
Well, as you say, I did write 2 books in the 1970s on the explorers of the Western Himalaya. So that's the region of really Kashmir and further west into Afghanistan and Pakistan, Gilgit, Baltistan and so on. And that was the region I knew best to begin with. It was while exploring that for my own interest that I hit on the idea of writing a book about the explorers of the Western Himalayas, and it turned out to be 2 books in the end. And it was slightly modelled on those wonderful books about the search for the source of the Nile that were written by Alan Moorhead in the early 1960s. And again, it was looking at a region which the world only knew about through the eyes of some of the earliest travellers. And for that reason, I had to do a lot of the trekking and travelling that they'd done for my own pleasure. I like writing a book that gives me a good excuse to go somewhere I haven't been.
Yeah, and like in the book itself, you've chosen to begin with the young husband expedition.
Yes.
What was the reason for that? And
there were 2 reasons for that. I thought a book like this, which dealt with so many different subjects in a particular area, needed something to hold it together. So in a way, introducing the 1904 young husband expedition right at the beginning of the book was a kind of structural device to hold the book together. And a lot of the characters who surfaced during the young husband, we call it an expedition, but actually, of course, it was an invasion, an incursion. A lot of the British officers and so on who surfaced during that expedition then stayed on or went back to Tibet afterwards and began studying Tibetan religion and shooting Tibetan wildlife and so on. And so I had a sort of, from the young husband expedition, I had a kind of cast of players in terms of the rest of the book. And it was interesting to me that of these people who went with young husband and who wrote accounts of the expedition later, some of them were deeply dismissive and unappreciative of Tibetan civilization, Buddhism and so on. But others became extremely sympathetic, and in fact, one of them at least actually converted to Tibetan Buddhism. So it was this contrast between the attitudes of foreigners, appreciation and adulation, and dismissal of such a dirty and harsh land that interested me. The great Italian authority on Tibetan Buddhism, a man called Giuseppe Tucci, always maintained that it was the terrain of Tibet that had created this extraordinary, what he called Lamaism or Tibetan Buddhism, that the demons and the monsters of Lamaism were a natural product of the environment.
Yeah. And something I was curious about was, like, with the expedition itself, like you said, it began as an expedition, and then for various reasons, like, why was it so important for that group to get to Lhasa? like what were the larger like geopolitical forces that were at play, and why, like, when they could not get agreement, why didn't they just turn back? Why did they go, turn so aggressive so suddenly?
I mean, this expedition to Tibet in 1904 was the brainchild of George Nathaniel Curzon, the most imperially minded of all Britain's viceroys in India. And he found a fellow enthusiast for involvement in Tibet in a man called Francis Younghusband, who actually led the expedition. The original idea was that British representatives would meet with representatives of the Tibetan government and decide on their mutual frontier, on where it should run, to avoid frontier incidents and so on. But in fact, the Younghusband expedition advanced into Tibet, which appalled the Tibetans, of course, and the Tibetan delegation that was supposed to negotiate with him refused to do so until he left Tibet. So there was a long sort of standoff for about 6 months. And then in the following year, that was in 1903, in 1904, Younghusband and Curzon decided to go ahead anyway, in effect. And a large armed escort, which was actually more an invading army of about 3,000 men, and elaborate carriage arrangements and so on, were set in motion. And the expedition had to fight its way, part of the way anyway, to Lhasa, to the Tibetan capital, before the Dalai Lama fled from Lhasa to Mongolia, and the British negotiated a treaty with the junior government in Lhasa at the time, which actually the government in London subsequently repudiated because it was too oppressive. But anyway, I mean, Younghusband himself was delighted. He was a very kind of forward-thinking, in the sense of aggressive leader, and so he thought he'd been a great success. He was very bitterly disappointed when he got back to London and found that everyone was acutely embarrassed by this treaty that he'd signed with the Tibetans. But anyway, this ended Lhasa's isolation. Until this time, 1904, Lhasa had been the ultimate forbidden city, the place that every enterprising explorer wanted to reach and report on. And Younghusband and his expedition ended this period of Tibetan enforced isolation and obliged the Tibetan government, to which the Dalai Lama subsequently returned, to open and have fairly normal relationships with the British government in Simla and Calcutta. So it was a nasty bit of imperial arm twisting. Quite a lot of Tibetans were killed. The British had machine guns and so on. The Tibetans were defending themselves basically with garden implements and sort of ancestral swords and so on. They had no army that would be recognizable as such. And so there was a certain amount of slaughter. I think probably it's reckoned that about maybe as many as 1,000 Tibetans died as a result of this incursion. But as I say, in terms of the book, there's only one chapter about the Younghusband expedition, and it's really to introduce some of the people who accompanied Younghusband and whose reactions to Himalaya are explored later on in the book.
Okay. Sounds good. And the second chapter, which talks of just plate tectonics and how the Himalayas were formed, is, in the first place. Firstly, it's fascinatingly written. Like it's like scientific theory, but again in a narrative style. So if you could tell us a little bit about how about the plate tectonics, and also like with the Himalayas itself. Even yesterday, there was an avalanche and 2 Polish
in Gulmarg.
Lost their lives. Like it just seems like it's still the mountain is young in a way. Like in fiction, we use this idiom of it's like moving mountains to kind of imply some like an impossibility. But in the case of the Himalayas, like a lot seems to be happening there. It's very dynamic, from avalanches to disappearing lakes to to even the like Everest, gaining height. So, like, what about the Himalayas, their formation and the way they're structured make it so dynamic?
Yes, I'm not a geologist or a paleontologist, but you know how books have a habit of running away themselves and writing themselves without you actually meaning to. And I just got so fascinated by what we had learned from Himalaya that I felt I had to explore this whole subject of how mountains are created by the clash, by the collision of tectonic plates on the surface of our planet, and how it was from study of the discovery, for instance, that there were seashells and small marine creatures in the limestone on the very summit of Everest. Discoveries like that made people scratch their heads and think, how did something that was on the floor of the ocean end up 29,000 feet, whatever it is, 8,000 meters above sea level? And this is the whole story of how our world was created and how it was understood through the theory of tectonic plates and continental displacement or dispersal. So I felt I had to do justice to Himalaya. I had to explain how studies of the region have influenced our whole idea of how the Earth was created, and also how the origins of life on Earth. And again, I then got rather deep into fossils. So there's two chapters after the chapter on the Young Husband expedition, which really deal with prehistoric and paleontological occurrences and what we have learnt from the study of Himalaya. And insofar as this tectonic plate movement is going on even today, and is probably the most dramatic tectonic activity that is taking place on our planet, it's still pushing up the Himalayas, and so Everest gets taller every year by, I think it's 3 or 4 centimeters or millimeters, I can't remember.
Centimeters.
Centimeters, okay. So Everest is getting taller all the time, but at the same time, of course, the other forces, like those of erosion and wind and frost and so on, are actually wearing down the mountains. So to get an idea of how much higher Everest is growing every year, being pushed up, you have to factor in some allowance for the effects of erosion. But with mountains, the more dramatic and the more spiky and the higher the mountains, generally speaking, the younger they are. And the Himalayas are some of the youngest mountains in the world, and are still forming, as I explained. So it was this question of the kind of dynamics of the mountains and how the mountains are being changed all the time, and how humankind are contributing to these changes to some degree, that's interested me more and more with the book. The book was originally intended as a portrait, as a profile of the region, and it turned, as I was writing it, more and more into a plea for some arrangement to conserve, protect, and safeguard this vital resource, which is Himalaya, particularly in terms of its water.
Yeah. And just from taking it forward in terms of the water question, with yes. So there's been a lot of investment, and like as you've kind of followed Himalayas over the year, you would have noticed like continuously increasing human endeavors and investments in the Himalayas. So with respect to that, like do you look at that with some worry, like for example the dams that are the large hydro projects? And
yes, I mean all aspects of conservation are relevant in the case of Himalaya. Quite a bit of the book is devoted to the number of species which are being exterminated or are disappearing anyway as a result of our failure to offer them any kind of protection. And in the case of the Chiru antelope, which is the creature from which the under fur is extracted to make chartreuse, pashmina shawls. is becoming almost extinct because China's People's Liberation Army soldiers patrol the Changtang, that's the northern plains of Tibet, in these pickup vehicles with machine guns mounted in the back, and just gun them all down. They're not interested in the flesh, they just take the skins, and they're extremely valuable. So there's the fauna and the flora of Himalaya are endangered. But perhaps, as you say, worst of all is the problems that water extraction is involving. We read about it in the paper almost every day now about some enormous new dam project that's planned for Himalaya. I suppose the two worst ones at the moment are in southeastern Tibet, where the Chinese are planning to dam the gorges of the Zangpo Brahmaputra River in southeastern Tibet with 2 or 3 dams, which will be 3 or 4 times the size of the Yangtze Dam, which is, I think, currently the biggest in the world, the most productive. It will also mean that India will lose the waters of the Brahmaputra River, which is almost certainly catastrophic, and Bangladesh, which is almost certainly catastrophic for the whole of East and South Asia. There are numerous other dams on the Mekong, which is another of the Himalayan rivers. I think that at the last count there were 34 new dams on the Mekong River in eastern Tibet and Yunnan in China, and indeed in Laos. But the other big major dam at the moment is on what India claims as its territory. In other words, on the Indus River, in what the map shows the north of Pakistan, a region which Pakistan is called Gilgit-Baltistan. And here a massive dam is being built as part of the, with Chinese help, or largely Chinese finance, to dam the Indus. And again, nothing like it has been seen in South Asia before, and it will change the shape of the country entirely. It's partly in India, because India, of course, claims the territories that did form the princely state of Jammu and Kashmir, and part of the dam is in territory that was part of Jammu and Kashmir. So it was actually India who managed to halt the financing of the dam by, I can't remember if it was the IMF or the World Bank, one or the other anyway. So that was stalled, and it looked as if it wasn't going ahead. But now the Chinese, President Xi Jinping's Belt and Road Initiative includes the whole of this region, and the Chinese are happy to meet the costs of this enormous dam, which will change what used to be called the Kohistan region of Pakistan forever. But there are lots of other dams all over the place in Nepal and in India, and others that are underway. And there seems to be no consensus amongst the states involved as to how these waters should be shared. As you know, at the time of partition, there was an Indus Waters Treaty for dividing the tributaries of the Indus between India and Pakistan, and that's worked quite well for 70 years or whatever it is. And we really need some much bigger umbrella agreement whereby all the major participants in this attempt to exploit the hydroelectric and irrigational potentials of Himalaya are regulated, and to which they all sign up. There is a body in Kathmandu already called ISIMOD, the International, I can't remember what it stands for Mountain Development anyway, into which all the states in Himalaya are signed up. But this has never really addressed major issues like how to share the waters of the region, how to ensure that the downriver countries receive a fair share of Himalaya's water and of the silt, the growing medium which gets washed down with the river. So there's a lot of ground to cover to kind of, impossible to halt this, but even to regulate this rush for water resources. and we will be hearing a lot more about it.
Yeah. I mean, like one of the difficulties with the region is just the number of nation states that that Himalaya is part of. So, like a couple of big world events, like the partition of India and the Chinese taking claim over Tibet. Like, do you kind of regard these as like, let's say, tragic from an ecology standpoint for Himalayas? Or do you feel like agreement is possible when there are so many nation states involved?
Well, I'm sure agreement is possible, but it's looking pretty remote at the moment. China nowadays refuses to acknowledge that there is even a place called Tibet. What used to be Tibet at the time of the Young Husband expedition has been, or was in fact carved up by the 1814 Simla Conference between British representatives and Chinese representatives. And they decided that what was Tibet at the time should be divided into an inner and outer Tibet, in the same way as Mongolia was divided. The inner Tibet being the bit that's nearest to China, and the outer being the bit that's furthest from China and nearer to India. But as I say, most of the outer bit of, the inner bit, the bit the Chinese regard as inner Tibet, is actually already been apportioned between neighbouring Chinese provinces, so they no longer consider that as part of Tibet. And the bit that is outer Tibet is nowadays called Shizong, the Western Treasure House or something, and is heavily exploited by the Chinese and is a great source of rare earths and minerals and so on, copper, chromium as well. Since the construction of a railway line from Xining in Qinghai province to Lhasa in, I think it was 2006, enormous numbers of Han Chinese have moved into southern Tibet, particularly the Lhasa region. And so that Tibetan culture has been diluted at the same time as Tibet's resources are being exploited. I don't know how this is ever. I mean, India is also, of course, following a similar course. A new railway is being built into Kashmir. The first railway ever to enter the Kashmir Valley is due to open, I think, either next year or in 2025. And so they're busy tunneling through the outer Himalaya at the moment. And this will undoubtedly, and perhaps hopefully advantageously for the Kashmiris, bring a bit more investment and tourist influx to the Kashmir Valley, but it will also certainly dilute the beliefs and the customs of the Kashmiris, and particularly the Ladakhis. So the whole region is threatened by its, I mean, it always has been. Himalaya was a source of, was a root of various religions spreading in the early ADs, and Buddhism spread through Himalaya into Central Asia. Islam spread from Western Asia into the western limits of Himalaya to the Gilgit-Baltistan region and so on, and subsequently Mongols and Manchus and so repeatedly invaded the country. So it's nothing unusual for Tibet to be apportioned amongst invaders and neighbours. But at the moment it's very difficult to see how any kind of international agreement can be reached when India and China in particular are so suspicious of one another, and of course Pakistan too.
Yeah. In the book you also kind of contrast, as a species, the way we manage the Himalayas with the way we manage Antarctica, for example.
Yes.
And that's
if you look at a physical map of the world, there are only 3 sort of white splodges on it, which indicate glaciated regions. One is Greenland, which is one big glacier really. The other is Antarctica, which of course is a mass of glaciers. And the third is Himalaya. It's that sort of white-purple splodge in the middle of Asia. and it's quite unique in this sense. It is far and away the world's highest ecozone. In fact, the world's only high-altitude ecozone. And it's certainly worthy of the sort of protection that's extended to Antarctica and to Greenland, and of course to other major ecozones like Amazonia and Equatoria and so on. So there is a good case to be made for Himalaya. In Antarctica, anyone who goes to Antarctica or has been knows that you have to take away everything you bring in. You have to, even an empty toothpaste tube, you have to take away with you. Nothing can be left in the region. There can be no rubbish, there can be no pollution, there can be no... they get more excited about an escape of head lice in Antarctica than in Himalaya, where even dead bodies are left lying on the slopes of Everest and K2 and the other big mountains. I was looking at a picture of the base camp at K2 the other day. It looked like the aftermath of an all-night music festival. Just masses of tents abandoned, bent poles, oxygen cylinders, plastic bottles and so on. And the chances of anyone getting a garbage operation going on K2 are pretty slim. I believe they try on Everest from time to time to clean it up. But it's not just the mountaineers either, it's the trekkers too. Along some of the more popular trekking routes, there's an endless string of ribbon development of cafes and internet cafes and cheap hotels and so on. So the whole of Himalaya is being exploited really with very little control whatsoever. In Nepal they issue far too many climbing permits every year, and particularly for Everest, and the window of opportunities of actually reaching the top of Everest get fewer and fewer, or narrower and narrower, and hence you have these amazing pictures that appeared a couple of years ago of this kind of conga of climbers on the summit ridge of Everest in their Gore-Tex outfits, holding on to one another, climbing up ladders that have been put in place for them, and on ropes that have been there for ages and have been constantly... I mean, it's ridiculous, really. People with more money than sense are being encouraged to go up Everest by the issue of far too many permits. But that's just an outstanding example. There are many others. And it's not just climbers and trekkers, there are also pilgrims. I should have stressed earlier that really Himalaya is the great centre of mountain pilgrimage, and there are so many mountains, particularly in Tibet and in Nepal, that are major pilgrimage sites, and pilgrims come in their thousands, particularly to say Kailash Manasarova in western Tibet. And there apparently the litter situation is appalling and nothing is being done about it. So Himalaya needs a sort of restrictions and management that is being extended to Antarctica and to some extent to Greenland already. And it wouldn't be difficult to do if one could get all the nations responsible to cooperate on it.
And there seems to be like a contradiction of sorts as well, because like you said, it's so revered as a spiritual place as well, and yet it's not taken care of in the way it should be.
Yes, I mean obviously there is a contrast there, but I mean that's not unusual. I think one could say the same of almost any pilgrimage site. That it becomes a ghastly mess. I was thinking of Varanasi sometimes. If it's not being properly, if the pilgrims aren't being regulated, and if there isn't any kind of backup to ensure that all rubbish and so on is removed, we all need to be more responsible citizens, not fling banana skins out the taxi window, but to take our rubbish away with us.
Absolutely. In terms of just like the populations that live there, like the number of people that live there, like has there been a steady increase in just the numbers, or is it Is it the mountaineers? Is it like tourism? What is the...
Well, there has been a steady increase, but to some extent this is offset by emigration. So, as you know, in India, in the northeast particularly, Nepalis are more plentiful than Bengalis very often. Nepalis have taken over Darjeeling pretty well entirely, and Sikkim, and as we found working in Delhi and so on. So there is in search of work, people do have to leave in large numbers from all the hill regions, and Nepal in particular. But that also is true of, has been true of Kashmir and Ladakh and of Kumaon, Uttarakhand and Sikkim, Bhutan too. So however much the population increases, there always seems to be the chance of substantial migration out of Himalaya.